academic keynote presentation this afternoon is from David Page at Duke University. Please join me in welcoming the speaker.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me today. I want to talk about machine learning from electronic health records, and I want to start, we really want to do the talk in 3 parts. I want to start with an applied section and then use that to motivate some new algorithms, and then use the algorithms to motivate some new theory, and if I'm really lucky, the new theoretical framework will be somewhat controversial. So we'll see if that works out. So even though I'm the new chair here in biostat, I'm actually a computer scientist. So 15 years ago when, well, let me actually start by thanking a number of colleagues who have helped me with this work in case I run out of time at the end. I don't want to leave them off, and especially some colleagues at the Marshfield Clinic who provided data and a lot of clinical expertise. So as a computer scientist, 15 years ago, when my doctor started spending all of our visits typing away on the computer, I actually liked that. I found that kind of comforting. And I couldn't help but think a few years earlier, if we had had an EHR, that this is what my record might have looked like. There'd be some demographic information and some diagnoses. They'd be coded, but maybe also some signs and symptoms. And it would have really been nice at about this point if someone could have predicted what I would have had the next time I came in. So 20-some years ago, I just moved back from the UK. I had 3 young children. I was starting my first academic job, first faculty job. I was teaching compilers and artificial intelligence and trying to get a research group going. And I woke up in the middle of the night with my heart doing this very crazy kind of bongo beat, and I was in atrial fibrillation. Now, atrial fibrillation is the most common form of cardiac arrhythmia, but it's not real common in 30-year-olds. I was fortunate in that after about 48 hours in the hospital, my heart rhythm did convert back to normal without my having to get shocked or any of the other things that one might need to do. But if we could have predicted this ahead of time, then maybe I could have taken a couple days vacation. Instead of going on high-dose ibuprofen that I was on, maybe I could have been on an aspirin every day and quit drinking the 5 Mountain Dews a day that I was drinking. So it could be really useful in many cases to make predictions, especially if there's an intervention available. So when we get EHR data, the EHR is actually optimized for fast updates, fast transactions, and reporting. But when we get it for research, it looks something like this, dramatically oversimplified, but it's a relational database with tables for diagnoses, labs, vitals, prescriptions, maybe even genetics these days. A very different view is that it's a data set like this with continuous time, irregularly sampled data. And so maybe these are somewhere on the order of 20,000 or 100,000 different variables or features that get recorded. And we get events, like maybe this is an atrial fibrillation event or a drug prescription, something like this. And yet most of our machine learning algorithms, as we know, some like continuous time Bayes nets, point process models, recurrent neural networks can work with this data, but most of this assume the data still look like this. They're just a really big Excel spreadsheet with one of the fields identified as the one we want to predict if we're doing supervised machine learning. So we could take any of these views. But in any case, whatever view we take of the data, what we'd really like to do as a machine learning researcher or as a patient, we'd like to come in with genetic data, clinical history, and maybe environmental exposures. And we'd like for someone to predict what are we going to have next month that maybe we'd like to avoid. Whoops. Or maybe if I could go on 3 different drugs today for my diagnosis, it'd be nice to predict that one of those is going to give me an adverse event, or one of those will be especially efficacious. I don't know why I'm fast forwarding so much here. At any rate, to get these models, we're going to get them from lots of other data on lots of other patients and applying machine learning. So that's kind of the goal here. We used Marshfield Clinic data with data on about 1 million patients. We actually had 1.5 million, but about 500,000 were people who had come up to northern Wisconsin once in their lives and gone snowmobiling or water skiing and had an accident. And so we're limiting ourselves to people who get almost all of their care in the Marshfield Clinic. We have the data I just described. We looked at atrial fibrillation. So if this pointer shows up for me, I'm not getting my laser pointer to work, so let me see if the mouse will work. This dark blue curve, this dark blue curve here is the atrial fibrillation ROC curve. It's an area about 0.7. There's a nice operating point right about here where you could intervene in a very mild way, like an aspirin a day, and maybe avoid the atrial fibrillation. AFib-induced strokes, harder to predict. AFib-induced mortality for those who stay in AFib is somewhat easier to predict. But we'd really like, after looking at a number of one-off prediction tasks, we'd really like to know how accurately can everything be predicted. Every coded diagnosis, maybe even every procedure or drug. But for now, we're going to look at coded diagnoses. It doesn't mean we'll translate every one of these models into the clinic, but it would just be nice to know how well can we predict events that happen. So we looked at this task. I do a lot of research in continuous time data methods and in relational database kinds of methods. So I was sort of disappointed that almost everything we did, you could do almost as well with that Excel spreadsheet view if you did a clever feature encoding and ran some type of random forest algorithm. And so we needed things to run fast to build models for every prediction task, so we ran random forest. And if you, let's see, if you look, I'm still not finding the right button for the pointer, so I'm just going to use this mouse. If you look here, this is actually a spreadsheet of areas under ROC curves for 4,000 different ICD-coded diagnosis codes. So AFib is one of the ones way over here at about 0.7. Myocardial infarction or heart attack is right around 0.8. You can see we're getting pretty high predictive accuracies. This is a month before first occurrence of the event in a patient. Here's the histogram of AUC 6 months ahead, 2 years ahead, and you've got to go all the way back to 20 years ahead before you actually are down near random guessing. We also ran a kind of retrospective study that simulated a prospective trial and said, suppose we now predicted prospectively on a new set of patients, what would that look like? Now it's a smaller set of patients, so we actually show the confidence intervals here, the kind of more pessimistic and more optimistic versions of the curve. But this is what the histogram of AUCs looks like. So when we showed this to the clinicians, obviously not every model are we going to translate into the clinic, but that's a lot of good insight for the potential of predictive modeling. But they immediately wanted to start making causal interpretations of these models. So first of all, these are random forests with an average depth greater than 20 in each tree and 750 trees per model. So they're kind of hard to look at, but we have methods of ranking features, and the clinicians immediately wanted to interpret these features as being causal. But we know there's lots of confounding here. If we look at the MI model, the heart attack model, for example, you see that one of the predictive features is a beta blocker prescription. But it goes the wrong way. We know beta blockers help prevent death from an MI, but having a beta blocker tells the machine learning system that the doctor thinks this patient's at risk of an MI, so the machine learning system makes use of that. So if you want to get more insight and even comprehensibility, it helps if the models align better causally. And if you're interested in something like pharmacovigilance, post-marketing surveillance of drugs, interested in adverse drug events, as many of us are, then you really need causally faithful models. Now, there's a long history of research into causal inference from observational data, or causal inference in general in statistics and biostatistics. But we'd like it especially to make machine learning algorithms more causally accurate. So I'll talk about some algorithms now and some insights that we got from work by Mark Suchard, David Madigan, Patrick Ryan, and others that takes this view of the data, the temporal view, continuous time view of the data. So when Congress told the FDA that they had to do post-marketing surveillance, the FDA and the pharma, the umbrella organization for the pharmaceutical industry, and the foundation for the NIH started a group called the Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership, who many of you are familiar with, and they set up some evaluation tasks that looked kind of like shown here. Here are 10 drug categories, 10 health outcomes of interest. See if we can match them up based on whether the drug can cause the event. If you imagine you didn't know that ahead of time, could you have recovered it from EHR data or claims data? So, so this is the OMOP task. You can't read all the details here, but across the top are 10 drug categories. Down the side, 10 health outcomes of interest. The reds are places where this is an adverse event. The drug can cause an occurrence of the event. The blues are cases where we strongly believe it can't cause the event. All the non-reds, we believe it can't cause the event. The greens, the drug helped prevent the event. The blues are a sample of negative examples. And so in this evaluation, lots of methods were run, everything from disproportionality analysis to propensity score-based methods, and across the board, graphical model-based methods, the kinds of things that Pearl or Robbins or Cooper or others would work on. A number of methods were used. And the task here was to rank your most probable pair adverse event down to least probable and do an ROC curve for your recovery. This is a little different than the classic held aside test set ROC curve. This is really a ground truth-based ROC curve for causation. I'm going to show you just this is a picture from Becca Willett. I really loved her illustration of acute liver injury and various types of drugs and conditions. But what OMOP did was set up a method where you would define drug condition errors. There might be various parameters to say, based on your prescriptions, how do we fill in the time you were on a drug? How do we fill in the time you were at increased risk after the exposure of a drug? And then some approaches can look at occurrences of events and whether they're during exposures or not. So to my reading of the results, there was no declaration of a winner, but to my reading of the results, the best performing method was self-controlled case series, specifically multiple self-controlled case series by Suchard and Madigan, Ryan, Simpson, and others. And the idea is to do a Poisson regression. And so we're going to learn, if my pointer will work without advancing here, we're going to learn a weight for each observation occurring based on each drug D, and this is the patient's vector for on a given day, were they exposed to this drug or not, according to the picture I just showed you. And we're coming up with an intensity for the Poisson model to predict number of occurrences in a period of time of this event, say myocardial infarction, in the patient's record based on the weights of the drugs to which they were exposed. Now, if you do this directly as I just described it, it doesn't work that great. But if you add this trick that's critical to self-controlled case series, then it works beautifully. And the trick is we say that every patient has a different baseline risk for this outcome O. That's the B little o shown here. And so if we take that into account, which it turns out you can do computationally efficiently, all of a sudden that partially adjusts for a lot of confounders, measured or unmeasured, and gives you some pretty good results on this task. So about the time we were looking at this, Jamie Thompson phoned me up in Wisconsin and said, look, a lot of people are using our induced pluripotent stem cells, or this one group in particular, I'm sorry, is using some of our pluripotent stem cells to find drugs that are on the market for reasons other than controlling cholesterol, but they seem to be lowering LDL cholesterol, and then they went and validated the findings in the EHR. Couldn't you just start with the EHR? So we're talking here about drug repurposing opportunities. It's the same problem as the adverse event problem, except it's a happy side effect of the drug, if you will. And so we tried some vanilla machine learning, and it was terrible. There was lots of confounding. And then we tried to learn a lesson from the work that I just told you about. So my student Charles Kwong said, and here we were looking first at fasting blood glucose. My student Charles Kwong said, well, every patient has a different baseline fasting blood glucose, but in addition, it's changing over time for every patient. My fasting blood glucose and my LDL cholesterol and my blood pressure are all going up over time as I age, unless I take some medications. So Charles said, let's take that into account. We're predicting fasting blood glucose, so now we're doing linear regression instead of Poisson regression. And every patient has not only a specific baseline, but a specific time-varying baseline. Here's the basic setup for standard linear regression. Here's a standard lasso penalty. Here's the new penalty that says, okay, we know if we give you a time-varying baseline, you can always explain the data with that and not uncover anything at all about the drugs. And so what we're going to say to counteract that is if you have 2 consecutive measurements within 6 months of each other, that's the sigma, and there's a big change, there's a big change in those baseline values that you're plugging in, then you pay a big penalty for that. And all of a sudden, when you do that, I should go back and say, when we tried vanilla machine learning, we took our top 40 drugs for controlling blood glucose or lowering blood glucose, and we colored in green the ones that we already know lower blood glucose, like insulin or metformin. We colored in red the ones we know elevate blood glucose, like glucose, and left in white the ones that we didn't know anything about. And we looked, and half of our entries were red. Confounding was all over the place. You get a prescription for insulin. You also get an entry in your record for glucose. You need glucose in case you get too much insulin. When we added a patient-specific baseline, we got the result over here on the right, where we got rid of a lot of the red. When we added the time-varying baseline, we got the result here, where we've gotten rid of all the red. The whites are potential drug repurposing opportunities. Some of these, like Dilaudid, you wouldn't give to control blood glucose, but some of these you might actually consider, or someone may be on them for another reason already, and you can use them to control blood glucose. So Charles then took this same idea back to the original ADE task and said we could have a time-varying risk for a binary outcome, like heart attack or atrial fibrillation. And when he did that, taking this view and the formulation here, same idea, but now applied to your risk, you're able to run an optimization routine very much like a fused lasso for this. And on the OMOP task, remember we have all these parameter settings to define drug exposure era and drug risk windows, so we get different results. But here's multiple self-controlled case series in the green. And here are Charles's new baseline regularization methods, which give a substantial improvement in most every case except when you have an everlasting risk window. You say once you've taken the drug, you're forever at elevated risk. In that case, Charles's method actually worked worse than the original MSCCS. Now, what we really wanted to do then was to extend this idea to other methods that we know are really good at adjusting for measured confounders, like graphical model kinds of methods. So we did that and saw some benefit, but I'll say there are huge challenges in going from linear models, like I have at the bottom here, to nonlinear models. We love nonlinear models for a lot of reasons. We can take into account all these other observed variables that may have an impact, as in a graphical model, thinking about deseparation and so forth. We'd love to use deep neural networks or random forests that could capture drug-drug interactions, for instance, that influence events. It turns out there are a lot of technical barriers to doing that. We were able to do it in one special graphical model case. We think we can do it with random forests and adverse drug events and deep neural networks. Wei Zhang's working on the deep neural network approach, but we think what we end up having to do with the time-varying baseline is move away from standard optimization approaches, and we maybe have to live with multiple local optima and make some additional statistical assumptions and do some sort of expectation maximization algorithm. Maybe also a different type of regularization on the time-varying baseline and make it smooth rather than piecewise constant. So these are some of the things that we're working on. But I want to take the last few minutes that I have to back up kind of big picture and talk about some theoretical issues. So one challenge here is even though methods like MSCCS and baseline regularization were giving strong results on the OMOP task, we didn't have the same kind of theoretical results that you would get with certain methods based on propensity scores or graphical models, where you can say under certain assumptions like no unmeasured confounding and various other assumptions, we can guarantee you make the right connections, the correct provable connections. Another issue or concern we had is that there are many causal discovery or causal inference tasks where you don't know ahead of time what the event might be. There's a lot of concern over generic drugs right now. And you wonder, is this generic drug, if I switch from brand to generic, is it causing anything in people that the brand isn't causing? And we don't know ahead of time to look for MI and atrial fibrillation. It would really be nice if we had a more general theory of causal inference that could capture this kind of diversity of problems. Here comes the controversial bit, is I'm going to make a pitch that perhaps here is one. Here's another motivation for the theory. So the real world data is limited by ground truth in causal discovery. We can't just hold aside a test set for causal inference. And synthetic data, often your data synthesizer mimics the assumptions of your algorithm, makes the problem too easy. And so we'd like some type of theory, but we don't want the theory, we think it's too strong for the theory to say, here's a guaranteed correct causal inference, or you're guaranteed every time to make the right causal inference. We think something a little more like pack learning would be appropriate. If you don't mind my putting you on the spot, how many of you are familiar with pack learning or remember the definition of pack learning? Okay, so not many, so let me show you the definition. And I won't take you through all the details, but I'm just going to say, well, I'll show you all the details, but let me just talk about part of it. The key property is we're going to assume there's some concept class that's labeling the data that we see. And I don't know why I've got this weird symbol showing up. That's supposed to be a bold X there that captures our domain of instances, say feature vectors over this set of variables. And I don't know why it's showing up like that right now. But at any rate, we're going to say a concept class is pack learnable if for any concept in this concept class that might label the data and any probability distribution. Boy, I really am having font issues. So this should be a D over X, a script D. I don't know. I should just quit there if I'm getting the thumbs down. The script D, any probability distribution over instances and any desired degree of accuracy or error rate epsilon and confidence 1 minus delta for any of those. If we get more time and data with lower error, higher confidence, and more complex unknown target concept, if we get more time and data with those, we want to guarantee with high confidence that we get a high accuracy concept. That's pack learning. Can we do something like that with causal inference? Here's an attempt. Feel free to criticize. I'm just going to take 3 more minutes and then give you time to criticize. I admit right here I'm already giving up on all distributions and limiting myself to computable distributions. So I'm going to consider 2 randomized Turing machines, M1 and M2, that generate strings over some alphabet A. M2 is going to see a string generated by M1 before generating its own. So M2 can make this problem really difficult for us. We might want to ease back the problem, say that we already know part of some underlying graphical model or causal model, say that M2 really doesn't get to see M1 strings, or say that make the problem harder, we only get to see M2's strings. So we have some training protocol that can govern these other aspects. But at the end of the day, the learning algorithm is going to get a test set, and it needs to say, did that come from M1 or M2? And the intuition here is, imagine M1 and M2 are causal models. Let's say Bayesian networks where the arcs, direct arcs, represent true direct causation. And M1 looks just like M2, except it has one more arc from variable A to variable B. And we want to distinguish those. That's the same as the question, is A causing B? And so we're going to have a family of these pairs, and we're going to say this family of pairs is pack inferable. So this first P is for protocol, the last C is for causal inferable. We're going to say that we can causally infer this under protocol P if this learning algorithm, for any desired degree of accuracy 1 minus epsilon, it gets more data and more time in 1 over epsilon, that it's going to correctly identify the source with that probability. The intuition is M1 and M2 might just differ by 1 causal association. It turns out since M2 is a Turing machine, it can learn, and so a positive result for this model would actually be a negative result for some generative adversarial network type approach, some adversarial training, and vice versa, much like in pack learning, a positive pack result is a negative one for cryptography and vice versa. My goal is not to describe adversarial training here, but it turns out they're linked. The first few results I'm going to show you are not really groundbreaking, but they're kind of minimum bar. A model would be lousy if it didn't give you at least these. So suppose we have two Bayes nets that differ by one arc. Okay, so those are our causal models. These Bayes nets can generate data. These can be our randomized Turing machines. It turns out we can inherit pretty easily the known results for situations where you want to infer one additional edge under various variations of protocols. So if we can actually do a randomized controlled trial, we can succeed in this model. We can succeed if we're in a situation where the shared structure is such that Pearl's do calculus would let us make inferences without doing the actual doing, that we could mimic the doing with observation. Again, the epsilon is letting us sample a bunch of data and train the parameters of these two models. So if we're told all of the model except this one arc, we can infer the arc. Similarly, with causal model learning algorithms like the famous PC algorithm from Gleimer, Speartees, and Shines. In addition, I won't have time to go through all the details, but you can get a positive result for self-controlled case series in the setting that I just gave you. But I'm going to jump ahead to, and I'll say there are some open questions like the time-varying baseline. I don't have a result there yet. But let me jump ahead to this generic, let me jump ahead, but just give two quick results. We've done some work with cases where there's some genetic variable that you know doesn't have a cause among your variables in your data, but you wonder, is it causing some clinical outcome that we don't know about? And so it turns out you can use standard supervised learning here if you have a pack learnable concept class in order to get a positive result in this situation. You can also extend this to cases where the variable maybe is a drug that does have parents if you make some strong assumptions that let you learn an accurate propensity model, and you can actually sample from that propensity model rather than having to mimic it with your distribution. But I want to finish with this brand generic case where we don't know what the generic drug could be causing, but we wonder, is it causing anything we don't see in the brand drug? And here you'd think all the confounding is handled for free because patients are on the brand or the generic for the very same reason, the same indications, and you could use the same patients who just got switched from brand to generic by their pharmaceutical company. And so we ran this trial, and it turns out you get all sorts of time-varying confounding. You get really nasty ones like something else changes in the health system the same time the generic drug comes out. And you say, wow, generic drug is causing people to get their prescriptions transmitted electronically. And so you say, if I can predict better than chance generic drug versus brand, then I found an effect that the generic's causing, but you can't because of time-varying confounders. It turns out in this model, you can, if you do something like inverse probability weighting with a propensity model, or if you add some control data that controls for the time to this, but the model actually shows you very clearly that the IPW approach is the better way to go. And in some synthetic data, these are the IPW-based approaches. These are just adding the control data to the cases, and it supports what the model says. But at this point, I'll just put up my conclusion slide because I'm over time by a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Controlling for time.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so here's the reason. There are two reasons that I didn't take that approach. One is just simply we started doing that work I showed you 4 years ago before these came out, and so And so we just stuck with that approach. But the much bigger reason is we're trying to predict many more outcomes, 4,000 different events. And we've also applied this to procedures and drug prescriptions. And so it's just a matter of the runtime. Now, a huge advantage to using a neural network is the opportunity to possibly discover shared structure or shared alternative representation with the internal nodes. And so those approaches probably long-term are going to win. And so really, it's mostly the practical matter of speed. We use Morone-Livny's high-throughput Condor cluster. I didn't get to tell you that earlier, to do this because the figure I showed you was the result of 30,000 different random forest runs, each of which was learning 750 trees. But great question. Thank you. Thank you.